We have some experts in the field to kind of give us some information, answer our questions, and just all around give us a clear understanding of what's been going on, what's being said, what's accurate, what's inaccurate, and what we can do next. So as far as who we have Mike Sapp. Mike started the Idaho 97 project. He is amazing when it comes to critical race theory and explaining it. So I'm going to let him do that. And then we'll introduce the rest of our panel.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to have the opportunity to explain and discuss what critical race theory is, and the idea behind it and the concepts behind it and where it's actually taught. So a little bit about my background. I'm currently the executive director of the Idaho 97 project, but previously to that, I was an executive officer for the University of Idaho. I was associate dean and interim dean for the University of Idaho College of Law, and I was a professor at the University of Idaho. And one of the courses that I taught was critical legal studies, and a component of that course was critical race theory. The reason I taught it in law school is because critical race theory is an extremely complex topic, and it's primarily focused on a law, and it's primarily focused on legal structures and things like that are involved in making decisions and how they affect people of different colors. Now, what's interesting right now is we're hearing this discussion about critical race theory and how it's dangerous to teach in K through 12 and things like that. And I'll just tell you right now, it's not taught in K through 12. And the reason it's not taught in K through 12 is because it's not a subject that gives itself to that level of knowledge and understanding. It's a subject that's taught in higher education institutions. It was almost exclusively taught in law schools. Now we start to see it in some graduate programs, and you're starting to see a little bit of it in undergraduate programs, but only for very, very advanced students. And I say that as one of maybe a half dozen teachers in the state of Idaho. That's right, 6 teachers in the entire state of Idaho who've actually taught critical race theory. So when you hear all this discussion about critical race theory, I'm kind of like, wow, really? I don't remember teaching it to that many people. And the reason is because it's a lie, and I haven't taught it to that many people. So where did critical race theory come from, right? And what is this concept of critical race theory? Well, the idea behind critical race theory actually started by a man named Derek Bell. And Derek Bell was a professor, I believe it was at Harvard, where he was an African-American professor. He may have been the first African-American professor at Harvard Law School. And he ran into some problems, perhaps not surprisingly, when he got there. And he kind of ran into the old guard, and he has this different life experience that he brought with him. And he actually left Harvard because of those difficulties. And those difficulties were focused on race. And he ran into institutional and structural difficulties when he was at the school. And so he kind of started this movement of critical race theory. Right? But critical race theory isn't actually the first critical theory to be applied to the law. Right? So critical legal theory actually was the first theory of critical assessment of the law. And that started in the 60s. And it started with this whole counterculture revolution and all the stuff that was going on in the 1960s and that kind of thing. And then critical race theory took some things from that. Derek Bell, and I'm not giving credit to the critical legal scholars for creating critical race theory, because they did not. Derek Bell did. People of color who experienced this did. But they did apply some of the same critical analysis to structures in the law in general. And in the end of the day, that's the rub. That is what critical race theory is. That is what critical theory is. And we see critical theory not only in race, right? We see it as this broader concept of critical theory. You see critical gender studies, you see critical queer studies, you see critical, we actually see critical studies that are focused around poverty and issues like that. And the key to critical studies is not sort of the name behind it, like the label of race, or the label of gender, or the label of class, or the label of sexuality, right? The key is the critical piece behind it. And what the critical piece is looking to do is the critical piece is looking at the structures that are in place, that are put in place by society as they affect that specific group. And they're looking at those and saying, hey, let's take those apart. Let's do this activity that's called deconstruction. And let's take it down, all the way down to its basic levels. And what is the source of this? So critical legal scholars were looking at powers that be, the powered class, as it were, and how that related to everybody else, right? And how they used legal structures then to maintain power. Critical gender studies looks at powered structures and how that manages to maintain male dominance over women in society. Well, critical race study does the same thing, but it looks at power structures and how that manages to maintain dominance over people of color by the dominant group, or the group in control, because that group is not going to be dominant in a very short time period. And so that's what the idea behind critical theory in general is. And so critical race theory then is looking at how these structures work with race and kind of the people behind it, right? I talked about Derek Bell, who I unfortunately never met. He passed away a few years ago. And it's actually one of my giant regrets as when I was a legal scholar, was never to have just met the guy and talked to him, just to get his ideas and see what his experiences were, because his experiences are actually different from my experiences. And so I would have loved to kind of hear what his thoughts were. But there's other folks who are involved in it. And one that we hear a lot of is a professor at, I believe she's at UCLA. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. And we all owe Kimberly Crenshaw an enormous amount. And she's a remarkably humble human being. I had the pleasure of meeting her one time, but she's also just brilliant. And one of the things that she came up with was this idea of intersectionality. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But this is, a lot of people are focusing on Kimberly, saying, "Hey, she did this and she did that." No. What she did is she came up with this brilliant way of describing interpersonal relationships, really, and how we exist in society. And she labeled it as intersectionality. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to what critical race theory really is. But there's other folks out there too. There's a scholar named Richard Delgado, who's known for his work in there. Mari Matsuda, she works in sort of Asian areas, looking in there. Patricia J. Williams, another brilliant scholar in this area. And then there's many more. I apologize if any of you are watching this and I didn't mention your name. There's so many people who have been well known in this area. And what's interesting now, though, is watching the young scholars and young students come up. We really have some brilliant young people who are also coming up in this area. But these are kind of the ones that kind of taught me what was going on. And so that's why I kind of talk about them a little bit more. So what is critical race theory then? Right. And so I talked about, critical theory and the concept of what that is. So critical race theory, right, it's really this, like I said, and it's an academic movement that looks to critically examine the law and how it deals with issues of race. And then it looks to challenge sort of these mainstream approaches, right? We talk about America being the melting pot. We've all learned this as children, but it's not really a melting pot, right? We have different experiences, right? And if we break it down, we learn these different experiences and then kind of deal with that. So one of the first and main tenets of critical race theory is the idea that race is a social construct, right? If you were actually to look at DNA from human beings from across the globe, right, it's virtually identical. Right, it's very, very close, but socially, right, we developed these different reasons to classify people, and you look at history, right? And you look at European dominance over the world, and then how they started classifying people in Africa, and they started classifying Native Americans, and they classified people in Asia, right? And all these different things. Well, that didn't happen until we had this sort of construct of society that said, no, well, we're different because of this, right? And it really has to deal with imperialism and not with actual medical science, DNA, and that kind of thing. Second tenet and core tenet of critical race theory is that racism in the United States, it's part of life, right? It's part of life for people of color, right? We experience it all the time. We see the world through this lens of race all the time. And I will compare this, and I'll use myself as an example of this. So you see me on the screen, you're looking at me, you're like, oh, Mike, your skin's pretty bright there. What's going on there, right? Well, I'm actually mixed race, right? I'm actually black and white. I was raised in Texas. I was told as a child, you're black. That's what I was told. I accepted that identity. I'm happy with that identity. I'm proud of that identity. But that sort of explains, one, the social construct, but also the racism that's kind of this normal experience, right? It's like, you're not one of us, you're one of them. Right. And ever since then, I was sort of classified as that. And now if we look at young folks today, right, who grow up from mixed race families, and it's more normal, it's seen more often, I think, now. They don't identify themselves as one race, right? They actually identify themselves as multiple races. I don't. I still identify myself as a black man because of my upbringing, because of what society said. And again, I totally accept that, and I'm happy with that. But that really is a stark example of this social construct and how race and racism works in government. And the reason it works that way is because I confused them when I was a child. I used to fill out the bubble of white and black, right? And their machines couldn't handle that. Systemically, the machine would reject it because you can't be both, right? You have to be one. And so they told me I was one. Right. And that brings us to this idea of what are the political interests of the dominant groups, and what are the political structures that are put in place? Well, that's what we call sort of a what is the word that I'm looking for? It's an institutional barrier right there. Right? The institution said you must be one or the other, and our machine can't handle this, so you must pick, right? And so one of the concepts of critical legal studies is to look at legal advances about people of color, and it looks at, right, they are only designed to serve the dominant interests, right? And so one of the ideas and concepts here is, well, there was a lot of civil unrest during the civil rights movement. And so people say, whoa, everybody slow down. All right. Let's get rid of these Jim Crow laws, right? Because this is a big problem. Well, that was primarily to support not the people of color, but it was actually primarily to support the United States government, right? And the United States government in addressing issues with the Soviet Union and addressing issues related to rights that the Soviet Union was talking about. And Derek Bell pointed this out in the 1970s. He pointed this out. And I believe it was right before he died or right after he died. The State Department finally declassified some wires, and those wires said exactly what he said. Right? They said, we can't have these issues of Jim Crow in the United States and be fighting the Soviet Union across the globe because it looks like we're doing the same thing. Right. And so it turns out he was right. Right. Now that particular point is sometimes used a little harsher than what other people say, because it really does say that the dominant the groups in power will use the law in a way that will either benefit people of color in a way that benefits the dominant group, or they will use the law in a way to hold back people of color in a way that benefits the dominant group. And we see that today. The best example of that in the state of Idaho right now is the anti-CRT bill. Right, because they feel threatened by people talking about race, because they're losing control, because of a bunch of other reasons. They are using CRT as a wedge and passing laws to focus people on that is this big evil, when really, like, the other problems are housing, economy, and all this other stuff that's really going on. But oh no, let's not look at that. Let's look at critical race. That's the boogeyman out there, right? And it's the best example there is, right? I couldn't give you a better example than that. Now, another thing is that minorities deal with being stereotyped all the time. And if you don't believe that, go watch movies. Watch movies from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today, right? And you can watch how they changed and how they actually would use the stereotyping as part of the funniness in it and all that kind of stuff in sitcoms. And then now how they actually use the difference to explain race. But that happens a lot. And another aspect of it is that no individual can be identified in one way, right? We all have multiple different aspects that cause our interests to intersect with one another, right? And this is where I come back to Kimberly Crenshaw and the brilliance of her stating this concept of intersectionality. Right. So we look on the screen right now and you see Professor Shakira Sanders, the first full professor at the University of Idaho College of Law. She is an African-American woman. I am an African-American man. Not only am I an African-American man, but I'm an African-American man with very light skin. Right. So I have different things that are in common with Professor Sanders. Right. And these include discrimination based on race, assumptions and stereotypes and that kind of thing that happen, that come out all the time. I have differences from Professor Sanders. These include that I am a man in a man's world. And I don't care what you say, this is a man's world. I know this because I have a deep, booming voice and I can command attention in a crowd that others can't do. I have lighter skin than Professor Sanders, and I am treated differently because of that. I will tell you that as a fact, right? And so that's where our interests diverge. So they intersect across race, they diverge across appearance and across gender, right? And so that's this concept of intersectionality, right? And then the last thing is that people of color are uniquely qualified to speak up on behalf of other members of other groups or their group about racism, the effects of racism. And to give you an example of that, I just did that. I just told you the difference between my experience being a lighter skinned African-American male and those of Professor Sanders, right? It's different, and I understand that and I see that. I can also speak very, very clearly and from the heart about members of the Native American community. Right now, just yesterday or 2 days ago, the Rosebud Sioux tribe buried children who 140 years ago died in a boarding school. They were taken away from their home. My ancestors were taken away from their home. Right. I understand that. And when those children were buried, I wept as well, because it's part of my memory and my understanding. And I can feel that and I can understand that and I can speak about that. Not only can I speak about Professor Sanders' experience, but I can speak about my Native American brothers and sisters. And that's the idea behind critical race studies. And that's kind of what gave us the founding and what it really is. Now, people look and say, right now, what they're using critical race studies, critical race theory as saying, oh, this is really racism. Well, it's not racism, right? In fact, it's much more focused on institutions, right, than people. Right. And that's one of the key differences between anti-racism, between inclusion, between what we used to call diversity, although people can't handle that word now, right? But that's one of the key differences is critical race theory is really looking at institutions, how the institutions operate, how people use the institutions to their advantage or to the disadvantage of others, right? And it's not about I'm Black, you're white. Right. It's not about that. It's not about judging you for what your ancestors have done in the past. It is about discussing the social construction of institutions and things like that your ancestors put into place. And that's a fact, right? That is a historical fact. If we look at the Constitution of the United States of America, right, I am 3/5 of a person in that Constitution. Right. And then you can't deny that. If you look at the Articles of Confederation for the Confederacy during the Civil War, it discusses my inferiority, right? We know that those documents exist. They're there. They wrote it down. So we're not saying you did that. We're saying we all need to address that. We all need to look at what effects has that had on our lives and in the world that we are here. So that is really what CRT is looking at. Now, what's the difference between CRT and teaching history? I just taught you history. And I just told you what's in the Constitution. I just told you what's in the Articles of Confederation, right? Those are factual things. They're right there. Now, what happened after the Civil War? right? Well, after the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, but then there was this real tenseness in the country, and then the North abandoned Reconstruction, right? And then not only that, civil rights started happening a few years after that, maybe 30, 40, 50 years after that. When civil rights movements started happening, the South started putting up Confederate flags and monuments and all of these other things, right? It wasn't actually in a response to the Civil War. It was in response to the civil discourse being caused by the civil rights movement. That is what CRT looks at. CRT looks at why that happened and what effect does that have on people today, right? That is different from the factual event of that happening and the factual event of the Civil War occurring, right? And the benefit of studying CRT, right? Well, the benefit of studying CRT is it informs us, right? It gives us a better understanding of what's going on in the world and how to make our country better, how to make our society better, how to actually work better with one another. Right? It's not about creating division. It's about actually saying, hey, this is my experience. I would like to talk to you about your experience. Do you see that? You don't see that. Well, this is what I do. What do you see? Right? Let's talk about it. Right? This is what it's about. It's about looking at the structures that are in place. Right? But more importantly than that, it's actually about showing us all how this affects all of us in different ways. And this again takes us back to intersectionality. CRT is now being used as a political buzzword. They tested CRT out before they started using it. And actually they tested it out with the term intersectionality. Intersectionality doesn't work. And the reason intersectionality doesn't work is because intersectionality actually shows that I have so much more in common with you that it's a problem for the powers that be. Because if I actually start getting and working together with people who are similar to me, but maybe a different race or a different gender or something else like that, then that causes them an issue. So instead of intersectionality, they put that away. Right. And if you notice, 4 or 6 months ago, they were using intersectionality, didn't work, and they got rid of it. Right. And now it's CRT. And the reason is because intersectionality is built into critical race theory. It's built into all critical theories. And the reason it's built into those and the reason they got rid of it is because it actually shows that it's really about bringing people together and it's not about dividing people. And this is something that people understand. And it's something that we have to do a better job at in teaching people. But that was a very brief 20-minute primer in CRT, what it is and its history. And if people have questions, I would love to answer them.
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to do just a brief intro of the rest of the panel because we have like tons of questions at this point. So we do have Shakira Sanders, who is, like you stated, the tenured professor in law at the University of Idaho. Just give us like a brief non-mic, intro, and then we'll introduce the rest of the panel real quick.
So my name is Shakira Sanders. I am a professor of law at the University of Idaho College of Law. I teach constitutional law, which includes race and gender discrimination under the 14th Amendment. I teach the First Amendment, and I also teach criminal procedure.
Great. And then we have Maddie. Maddie is going to do her intro really quick.
Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm a teacher here in the Treasure Valley, and I'm just here to share a little bit about my own experience in the classroom, what my lesson planning process looks like, and how topics of race and ethnicity can impact students' experience and how I advocate for them inside the classroom.
Perfect. We also have April Coleman.
Hi, my background is in education. I've been an elementary and middle school teacher as well as an adjunct professor at a local university in the College of Ed. So I was working with future teachers. I also have my degree in educational leadership and my administrative certificate. I've worked on the administrative side of schools as well.
Thank you. We have Amy Kohlmeyer. You're on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
My name's Amy Kohlmeyer. I'm a retired educator. I spent 37 years in education, 22 of those as a classroom teacher. Most often I was an English teacher. I also taught Russian. In English teaching, I taught advanced placement courses. I later became an administrator, so I have experience at the junior high level, where I was at Fairmont Junior High School. And Fairmont happened to implement a program called AVID, which is Advancement via Individual Determination. And I participated in that and later was a principal when Fairmont became a national demonstration school. Also, I was principal at Boise High School and then later a district administrator and area director for the Boise district.
I see that Amy had an opposite problem with me. She was on mute and I just kept going like, hey, let's get started.
And then we have Tekla, who's going to answer some questions for us as well.
Thank you. My name is Tekla Gabriel Michael. I worked I was educator at a local high school, and I'm a board member at a local school as well.
Perfect. So we're going to dive right into some questions that we have from the public. It's just and from folks in general, just to kind of clarify some of the information we've been getting, because it's a little mucky right now. So we got a clear understanding of what CRT is and what it's not. Professor Sanders, can you kind of give us a little background on how the CRT, as far as the legislature goes, like how is this going to affect a parent's right and the student's right to quality education at this point?
Yeah, so there are a number of issues that I'm sure a lot of parents have questions about, especially as it pertains to the legislature's ability to ban a certain topic from education. And of course, looking at the legislation itself, I'm sure many parents are very confused about actually what is or is not banned, and whether any ban in and of itself would pass any type of constitutional muster. So I have a very, what I hope will be, well, I'm sure will be a very quick presentation to possibly help some of the folks here today try to understand some of these concepts. And also this can give you some reference information for those listeners to write down and take back home themselves. And if people want a copy of this, I'm more than happy to provide it as well. So one of the big issues that I'm sure people have questions about is the First Amendment aspects of this. The First Amendment guarantees a number of rights to people, the right to religious freedom, which includes religious belief and expression, the right to free press, the right to speech, and what we know as the right to petition. And also what's not on here is this right, or is on here is this right to assembly, which includes the right to association. I think most people have immediately picked up on the free speech issues, and that's what I'd like to focus on. But one thing I do want to just let people know is that when it comes to the right of religious belief, the US Supreme Court has not limited that to established religion. That's more of a right to belief in general. And so if there is a belief that is sincere and meaningful to you and that holds a place in your heart, where a religion would be, or that is just important as religion, that is protected. And so here, many people hold beliefs about the importance of understanding race and racial history. And so I think that there could be issues there. But like I said, I really want to focus us on the First Amendment. Here is a list of popular First Amendment topics that you see litigated in court. This critical race theory ban implicates this entire list. One, the court has said as a first step in any First Amendment analysis, we look to see if there is a distinction based on the content of the speech. And clearly here you have an intent to ban based on content. There are issues of vagueness and overbreath, how broad these theories are, right? If one can't learn about critical race theory in a law school, then where it may be useful to learn, you can see the overbreath issues. The vagueness issues really come in the discussion. Many people have commented that they don't even really understand what this legislation bans, and that implicates vagueness issues. One of the more important aspects of this second category is that there is this thing that's called third party standing. So you yourself don't have to show that you find it vague. You really just have to show for anybody it would be vague or overbroad. This is clearly a prior restraint on speech, and this legislation doesn't provide a lot of guidance to individuals. That's a huge issue. Of course, it's a classic infringement on speech. From what I've seen, I don't think this falls into any category of any of the established and recognized categories of unprotected speech, which the Supreme Court said is a very small, very narrow category, like child pornography, that individuals are allowed to ban. This last one is more about the form analysis. And this is where there is some trickiness, I think, for teachers in particular. The US Supreme Court's jurisprudence on the speech rights of government employees is unclear. But here, because we are talking about legislation, clearly this is an issue of public concern. And so there, I think it is very likely that it could be safe for teachers to speak out about this. But again, where school policy starts and legislation ends, I think this all adds to some of the lack of vagueness. I think there are, of course, for parents, due process concerns that I would have. If you want your child to learn about race, racial history, including different theories about race, the Supreme Court has said there is support for parental rights to have some control over your child's education, whether you're in public, especially when it comes to public school education. These are some of our oldest substantive due. Nebraska dealt with Nebraska not wanting to teach any other language other than history. Why? Because they said they wanted to promote Americanism. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? There, the court says that that is not a legitimate purpose or a legitimate enough purpose to ban an entire subject. Pierce versus the Society of Sisters dealt with an where they tried to say you can only get a good education in a public school. Again, the court said you can't tell parents that they can't send their children to private schools if those schools are good enough. So there again, upholding this right of parents to have some control over their children's education. Same issue involved in Wisconsin versus Yoder. There, an attempt to tell Amish parents that they have to send their kids to school past a certain age. So again, a lot of this due process question will come down to why do we want to ban critical race theory? And given what I've heard out of the legislature and the anti-indoctrination task force, as I like to call it, it is unclear to me whether we have heard a sufficient enough rationale for banning race studies, including critical race theory. Finally, I do want to touch upon the Equal Protection Clause, which applies to race. And again, some of our oldest Supreme Court jurisprudence comes about because of the treatment of individuals based on their race. And here I'd like to remind us of the history in this country of denying to certain people of color, particularly enslaved individuals and Native Americans, the right to speak their own language, the right to practice their own religion, and the right to learn and teach the history of their own ancestors. And we have seen that since the founding of this country. And in fact, some of the Supreme Court jurisprudence on the First Amendment from the early 1900s, when they came up with this theory of incitement of illegal activity as one of those areas of unprotected speech, it was out of race riots in the 1980s and a desire to control the speech of people who are advocating on behalf of civil rights. And of course, when we think about a case like Dred Scott and the denial of any Bill of Rights protections to enslaved people, except to the extent that they are the property of another. And we fast forward almost 40 years to Plessy versus Ferguson after a civil war and 3 amendments to constitutionalize the right to be treated like everyone else in this country. We still had a Supreme Court that said forced separation did not offend our Equal Protection Clause. And it took almost another 70 years to get a Civil Rights Act that said you must treat African Americans and other people of color with dignity in the economic marketplaces. And so for me, when we think about some of the history of race in this country, it is pretty clear why individuals may not want to teach about this history. But what is also pretty clear is that there is a right of parents to be involved in the educational decisions of the schools in their neighborhoods, especially the public schools. And if there is a parent that thinks it is important for their children to learn factual history of this country with dealing with race, I think it will be pretty hard for a state legislature to say that it hurts the feelings of white students. And for our state legislature in particular, I do just want to remind them of a number of provisions of our state constitution, including this idea that the political power is inherent in the people, and that power must be used for the equal protection and benefit of our citizens. And that even under our state constitutions, individuals have the right to speak freely and write and publish on all subjects. And Article 9, Section 1 establishes a Republican form of government that depends on the intelligence of its people. And what's interesting to me is the way Article 9, Section 6 says that there shall not be distinctions or classifications of pupils on the account of race or color. And so if we are deliberately choosing not to teach the race and the importance of race and how that may affect some of our students in our public schools, then again, I think we can see the lack of a proper rationale to justify this particular critical race theory ban. And let me just finally say, as an educator in Idaho for 10 years now, that I have spent a lot of time speaking out about the racial discrimination that occurs in our institutions and about the racial insensitivity that comes out of the mouths of people at our institutions. And I've been constantly told that that is protected First Amendment activity, no matter how atrocious or racist. And so where are we going from here? Are we still going to allow racist behavior in speech and yet put a ban on speech that counters that? I think that is why, if challenged in court, we will begin to see the dismantling of this critical race theory ban. And I will urge all parents and all teachers who are concerned to document your lives out of the racial discrimination that occurs in your communities, to counter the need for these ignorant pieces of legislation that we saw on this subject. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
I appreciate you, Dr. Sanders, for that awesome explanation and that brief but very thorough explanation of how this is affecting us legally. So I know that right now, everybody believes that K through 12 has been just overrun with critical race theory, and it's in all of our stuff, and our kids are just going down the road of indoctrination. So I want to go over really quick with our educators and our administrators how we actually get to what we teach kids every day. Because I know this isn't like I'm gonna just teach all the white kids that they're racist today. Like, I know that that's not what we're doing. So I know, Maddie, you're in the classroom still on a daily basis. Can you go over kind of how you're getting to where you see, like how you get to your lesson plans, what kind of that entails?
Sure thing. I'll just offer a brief explanation as to how most teachers are kind of going about their lesson planning process. When teachers go to plan a lesson, there's typically already a lot of groundwork that's already been set. So we all teach from a set of state decided grade level content standards. That's the basis for everything that we're doing throughout our classroom. Those were not standards decided by us. Teachers have either sequenced these themselves or been provided an outline by their district or their curriculum. And we break these standards into daily learning targets that are displayed to students so students can gauge whether or not they've met the target for the day. Teachers would only include race into these learning targets if it makes sense with the content or the historical perspective that they're covering. So if there are like a racial impact of any sort of the history that they're teaching or an association, it's really just forgetting and rewriting history, not to mention them. But outside of that, teachers are not including critical race theory as a part of their lesson plans. That is really focused on those content grade level standards that were set by the state. I've been incredibly lucky to work in a professional learning community in my district that's willing to share resources, ideas, and instructional materials, which means my classroom is never its own bubble of learning. It's the work of a lot of people and a lot of ideas coming together. So anything that I teach in my classroom and the learning outcomes that I expect for my students have been thoroughly vetted by other teachers in the district to make sure we're all providing the same level of education to our kids. My classroom's also open to observers. So that could be other teachers, district employees, instructional coaches, or admin walking by or observing. And ultimately, we're strapped for time to try to get all of the content in that we need to. The content standards that I teach are a lot of information for a middle school brain. And every teacher I know is focused on creating the most meaningful learning experiences for their students in the time that they have. And I know that Mike mentioned this earlier, but teaching critical race theory, which is far above what our students' brains can comprehend, kind of goes against a lot of what we're taught to do as teachers. We are teaching to their developmental stage and what they're ready to learn, and making sure we sequence it in a way that's not going to overwhelm them, but where they're able to build connections and make those connections on their own. So anytime I'm teaching, it's been observed, discussed by outside stakeholders and other people outside my classroom before I teach. I can't imagine teaching in isolation. I don't think it's what's best for me or my students. I think there's a lot of other perspectives that I can't bring to the classroom. So it's really important that I am reaching out to other educators and other people to make sure what I'm teaching is going to be relevant no matter what my students want to do. And ultimately, the state is deciding what I teach. I'm just deciding how I teach it. And I think that that's an essential professional freedom that I need to do my job well to make sure I'm catering to the student identities I have in my classroom.
Gotcha. And so let me ask you this. You mentioned the different identities in your classroom. You do, though, even though critical race theory is not like the focus of your lesson, diversity, though, is something that is fostered in class. So you don't just act like everybody's the same and we just kind of.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that too. I think that there's a big mix up between critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching, same letters, but very different things.
Okay.
So like identity and including topics of race and culture often come up in my classroom. And it's often like in the spirit of creating an inclusive learning environment for all my students and meeting them where they're at, making sure they get what they need in order to learn. I think most educators would agree that our whole goal in education is to teach kids to think for themselves and generate their own opinions. And this includes like exposing them to multiple perspectives on any issue, whether they are the same perspective as mine or not. It includes talking about reliable data and what counts as evidence and what is fact and what is history and what is not. But ultimately, the ideal classroom is a place of discourse and differing opinions for every single one of my students. And that like requires us to acknowledge where they're coming from, the different identities they bring into the classroom, their different experiences, because ultimately that's going to strengthen our community, not hurt our community. And they have a lot to learn from each other as well. I think that our goal is to teach every single student who walks into our doors. And that means every child, no matter their race, gender, sexual orientation, primary language, home situation, culture, or politics. And I think in order to do this effectively and meet them where they're at in the learning process, I have to be cognizant of teachers or of students' identities, how they're the same as my own, how they're different as my own, how some perspectives I can't necessarily understand, but I can ask questions and try to figure out what students need from me. I make sure that I never share my own political leanings or things like that in my classroom in an effort to make space for every single one of my students. And make sure that we have a space where it's open for discussion for everyone. No question is a bad question if it's coming from a good place and all my students are trying to learn. And I would be failing at my job if I were telling kids exactly how to do every assignment, exactly what to think. I'm teaching them how to think. And that includes thinking about race, how it impacts them. It includes thinking about how their identity might make their experience different from somebody else's. Race itself is not a topic I teach, but race and culture are definitely identities that can influence how my kids learn and accommodations and learning experiences that are going to be relevant and meaningful to them.
Thank you so much for that.
Could I jump in just for a second?
Okay.
And focus on something that Maddie was really focusing on just now. And what Maddie was focusing on was her professional skills as a teacher. And she was focusing on the techniques that she utilizes to teach. And that's a very important distinction that we are not making, that our legislature in particular is not making and has not made. Our legislature is angry about allegedly a student being embarrassed, although no one's seen this video and no one knows, and we can't find the student and we can't find the people who've reported it. However, that's what they're angry about. They're actually not angry about the subject matter that was being taught, but they are attacking the subject matter that was being taught. What they are actually trying to remedy is an alleged technique of teaching problem, right? So they're using the wrong remedy for the issue, right? If a student is embarrassed in the classroom, if a student is upset in the classroom about how you did it, that's a classroom control issue. That's a teaching technique issue, and that's an issue that relates to the professionalism of that teacher. No teacher wants to embarrass, upset, or harm a student of theirs, even if that student disagrees with them, right? That's our job, to teach them, to give them tools to use this later on. And we don't want to hurt them. But it's an extremely important distinction that should be made. Maddie is talking about her skills as a teacher and how to use those skills to appropriately address these issues with the appropriate students. The legislature is talking about a subject matter, to use that subject matter to take total control of a classroom, which is a completely different thing.
Gotcha. April, can you jump in though, really quick, and just kind of go over, because you were an adjunct in an ed department, so you can speak to kind of what Maddie was saying as far as what is taught to teachers skill-wise for classroom control.
Yeah, we have in Idaho, it's called Idaho Standards. They're for teachers. So before a teacher can be certified in the state of Idaho, they're recommended for certification, usually, well, always by a university. And when a university says Maddie is a candidate for teacher certification, they're saying that of these, there's 10 standards, but there's hundreds of little statements saying that she is qualified because to do these things. She is, and I'd like to point out some of the things that we're teaching teachers, some of the dispositions that we're looking for, and some of the skills and professional judgments that we're expecting them to have. So these things are taking place in classrooms. Teachers are showing these, like I said, dispositions because they've been trained to do that and because we're looking for them. So for example, in standard 2, we say, the teacher knows how to access reliable information about the values of diverse cultures and communities, and how to incorporate learners' experiences, cultures, and community resources into instruction. There's several standards to do with this. We're looking for teachers to bring multiple perspectives. We're looking for teachers to respect learners as individuals that are coming from different backgrounds, different families, different cultural experiences. We're looking for teachers to collaborate with families and members of the community to foster a learning climate of openness, mutual respect, support, and inquiry. There's a couple more that are really, really valuable to this conversation.
Yeah.
The teacher realizes content knowledge is not a fixed body of facts, but it's complex, culturally situated, and ever evolving. The teacher recognizes the potential bias in their own representation of discipline and seeks to appropriately address problems of bias. So in a teacher's preparation to become a teacher, a teacher candidate, we're engaging them in these conversations to identify their own bias. And in fact, there are standards that say we're to do the same with our students. or to
Wow.
engage them in looking at these, looking at their ideas and testing them against, what's evidence say, what are some other perspectives, and engaging teachers so that they will then engage their students in similar conversations.
Definitely, definitely. So knowing that, Amy, because you did AVID and English as a EL, right? Um, the focus of the task force is those two very diverse classrooms. So I guess the confusion for me as a parent would be, if the teacher is supposed to learn to teach a diverse classroom of children, why then is the diverse classroom of children being targeted?
I think that's I think that's a very good question. One thing that Maddie said, and also April, that I want to touch upon from the perspective of an administrator, is that as teachers are preparing to become teachers, and when they are involved in the active instruction, they are closely supervised. And the state of Idaho uses something called the Danielson model. And right in the evaluation instrument of teachers, the Danielson model has 4 different kind of domains. And the first domain is planning and preparation. And one of the things that we look at as administrators going in and evaluating that teaching is that the teacher demonstrates a knowledge of students, child development, the learning process, special needs, student skills, knowledge, and proficiency, and interest and cultural history. So that is baked into what we look at as a proficient teacher. In addition to that, there is a setting of instructional outcomes which has to be suitable for diverse students. There's another domain, the classroom environment. And one of the areas of that is creating an environment of respect and rapport. Teacher interaction with students and student interactions with each other. So through this whole process, we are trying to get a learning environment that is conducive for things like collaboration, for trust, so that students can work together in ways and read together and do projects together. So we actually sometimes need to point out differences. If we acknowledge those differences, then we can learn from each other. So I think that's an important part of what's going on in the classroom. As far as the AVID program and the EL program being targeted, things that were of interest to the task force, the AVID program is a elective program for students that want to get into college, who might not have, the parents that have gone to college. They don't have some of the advantages that other kids have as far as knowing what to do and how to do it. So it originally, well, at this point too, it seeks to identify a wide range of students, kind of in the academic middle, but we're always seeking students who are from socioeconomic backgrounds, usually, economically challenged, or racial or ethnic groups that are underrepresented in college. And to deny that certain groups are underrepresented in college is foolish, So one of the things that AVID does is it stresses that in the AVID program in each school should mirror the overall kind of demographics of the school. So if, say, you have 5% Black students in the school, you should have 5% Black students in the AVID program. And so that's a thing that, yes, you have to acknowledge there are those differences. We don't pretend there aren't differences. In fact, those things are baked into standardized assessments. We have to report out on all of our different student groups, all ethnic and racial and socioeconomic groups. So it's kind of a puzzlement to me why the AVID program was targeted. And as far as the Yale program, there's a little bit of controversy about what they meant. They mean English learners, which is, for educators, that's what we call our programs that teach newcomers to America to speak English. But it means some other things too. It can mean experiential learning. It can be maybe EL, English language arts. And so my understanding now is that the task force was not aware of what the acronym meant when they requested information from the Boise School District. The Boise School District interpreted that as they asked for EL materials. The Boise School District interpreted that as English learners. And then the task force complained that they didn't get what they had asked for. So again, unfortunately, that was very confusing for everyone. And it would have been helpful if maybe the task force had more people on it who were actually educators who would have said, hey, what do you really mean there? So it was a waste of their time, a waste of the Boise District's time.
And Katie, do you mind if I read off a comment from another educator from the EL perspective?
Sure, just real quick.
Okay, I can also wait. I don't know how quick it will be.
Oh, okay, let's hold it till the end. Because I have a question for Tekla. So with everything that's happened as far as teachers and superintendents, you being a board member and knowing that most school districts have boards, even if the principal and the teachers and the superintendents agree, the board still has to approve curriculum, correct?
Yes, but before that, the curriculum in Idaho specifically, I believe it's similar to other states. The curriculum is actually approved at a state level. There is a process called curriculum materials adoption procedure. This process is adopted by a group of people called Curriculum Materials Selection Committee, about 10 or above, mostly 10 and above people appointed by the Idaho Department of Education. They are appointed for a 5-year term, and mostly these people are from various stakeholders, mostly from certified Idaho classroom teachers, Idaho public school administrators, Idaho higher education officials, parents, trustees, local Board of Education members of the Division of Career Technical Education, and State Department of Education personnel as well. So for any curriculum that used in Idaho educations, it has to go through this committee, and it's reviewed and approved by the committee to be used in Idaho education districts. The advantage of this is just the materials are adopted on a 6-year term, so they rotate every 6 years to adapt change, especially in our time as we really rely on technology, and technology is changing every night. It really helps to update the education curriculum. That's one of the advantages. Also, the other advantages are the contract of the books are adhered to 6 years. So the school districts will get books for the same price for 6 years, or the state would get a discount if the publisher company decided to give a discount level for other states or other districts. So there is the advantage of that. So there are a lot of advantages listed, and I'm referencing from the Idaho Department of Education website itself. But I'm going to read a couple lines at the bottom. Instructional materials are screened and thoroughly reviewed by the subject area expert to ensure that essentials and elements are covered. And then under that, any materials reflecting adversely upon individuals or groups due to race, ethnicity, class, gender, or religion are not approved. This is listed at the Idaho Department of Education. Now, we're talking about this because the legislature has an issue and accusing certain school districts, blaming that they are teaching critical race theory. If that's true, or if they believe that supposed to be true, isn't they supposed to work with their government body, the Department of Education? If they believe that critical race theory has been taught in Idaho schools. Again, I know it was mentioned by Stas and Dr. Sanders, and from my own personal experience, I have never encountered critical race theory lectured in K-12. That's what I was working at high school, or even through my college journey. I went to BSU undergrad, and I'm working on my master's in public administration. And now I have actually learned that critical race theory is specifically taught in law school in Idaho, and I'm sure other schools are adapting to make sure that a lot in the generation is understand of that subject matter. But that's totally false. K-12 in Idaho as not giving that lecture. So again, if that's a problem, the government needs to work with itself. The Idaho legislature is overreaching the Department of Education and accusing school districts, which is not their authority, or they do not have the power to adopt curriculum at district level or school level for private schools in that matter. So it's really confusing, and people need to understand that the legislature needs to work with its body, with the government.
So I've been listening to our educators, and you guys have said a lot. And a lot of what I'm hearing is the Idaho education system, based on what's written currently for the standards for teachers, the standards for curriculum, is that it must be something that can be taught to a culturally diverse group of students. So if that's the case, then why are we now investigating what it sounds like to me the state wrote into, one, its constitution, two, its Department of Education requirements, its teaching standards, its curriculum standards. As a parent, I'm confused.
And Katie, if I can add something to what you're saying, because I think there's probably quite a few parents listening going, our school's actually not that diverse, right? Like, we're not teaching a diverse group of students, so this actually doesn't apply. But I do want to pull back to our teachers were trained toward global mindedness, and we even have a statement that says that they will draw in. Here it is. The teacher incorporates issues of gender, race, ethnicity, religion, national origin into the examination of history. So yes, there is a responsibility on the part of the teacher for culturally responsive teaching, responding to the students that are sitting in front of them. But yes, there's also the expectation that the teacher is drawing these issues into the examination of history, regardless of who the students are that are sitting in that classroom. So we have this coming from both places, where teachers are literally doing their job. And we do have a document that we wrote and we sent out to teachers, and over 60 of them have signed it, saying what's being called CRT is literally us doing our job. And we are committed We are doubling down on doing our job and doing it well and serving the students of Idaho really well. And part of the reason we couldn't have more teachers on the panel is because of the political climate right now. They did not feel that it was safe for their job or maybe even safe for their person
Yeah.
to speak up about that.
Go ahead, Ms. Sanders.
And I just want to take this opportunity to co-sign something Tekla said, and also put in a little bit of the law school recruitment for your understanding of these statutes. But Section 9, Article 2 of the state constitution, which describes the Board of Education and its duties, does make clear that the general supervision of the state education institutions and public school system of the state of Idaho shall be vested in the State Board of Education. So I think that that is a wonderful point there about legislative overreach. So Tekla, I will soon be stalking you to complete your law school materials so that we can recruit you. The other thing I just wanted to add here is just a little bit of sort of how this has worked a little bit in real life for us here in Boise at the law school. You know, many of you may have recently read that the law school will soon be moving to Concordia's old law school building. And you may not have heard anything in those stories about the art in our law school building, which includes 2 panels where Native Americans are being lynched clearly by white settlers, right? There's a whole ridiculous tableau story that leads to these lynchings. Now think about that. That's a law school building, right? That is clearly a racist imagery that students have had to go to law school surrounded by for the past 7 years. And yet, none of that was discussed during these debates around critical race theory bans, right? And the rationale there being, we don't want racially insensitive climates for people. And yet at the only state public law school and the only law school in the state, students do nothing but go to school in a visually racist environment. And there have been no programming over it, right? No explanation of it. And so this just shows you some of the issues that we have here with regards to perspective. And I think this goes to what Mike Sachs was talking about in terms of critical race theory and the perspective that it tries to give people. Now, I try to avoid that whole situation, right? I don't take the stairs in our building. I take the elevator because I don't even want to walk past the murals. But some time to time, I do talk about them and lecture them on the Second Amendment, right? In that mural, you clearly see a weapons advantage between Native Americans and the white settlers, right? And this is all part of the history of teaching our Second Amendment. So if the legislature is telling me that I cannot bring this into the classroom, then I'm going to have a big problem when it comes to our Constitution, because context is everything. And even some of those legal theories that the legislature does respect, like originalism, forces you to bring in racial history when you're looking at the framers' meaning for certain things like the 3/5 clause, right? You can't take race out of that. So I think what's clear here is a desire to recloak racism and what it is, and a desire to continue to fuel this fire of some type of racial replacement of a majority population with a majority minority population. I'll just also point out too, that for us in Idaho, I think some of this discussion may also be to divert attention from the events of January 6, 2021.
Well, what she said. So Amy, let me ask you this. Well, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, I just had a follow-up to both of the prior statements. First of all, that law school building was a courthouse before it was a law school building, and that is an extrajudicial killing that is depicted in the grand staircase of a courthouse.
Wow.
That is clearly something that the CRT was designed to address and focus upon. Because an extrajudicial killing does not belong in a courthouse, period. The second thing that I wanted to just briefly touch upon was something that April talked about teaching students essentially to be well-rounded citizens. And that is really what a lot of this education is about. And one thing that's missing from all of this, and I would hope that perhaps this sector would start speaking a little bit louder, is that private industry expects students to come to them already with knowledge about these sort of things, right? This is an essential soft skill to being a trained worker in the future workforce. And for the Idaho legislature to say, oh, we're just going to, by fiat, make this avoiding what the reality of our world is, attention to, and make sure that people remember as well. It's not just what we're teaching them. It's about their future and their ability to be competitive in the market.
So that was what my question was going to be to Amy and Maddie, as far as like the lack of diversity in education and not looking at things through the context of cultural and racial diversity. Do you think, in your opinion, it will make Idaho students ill-prepared to work or live anywhere outside of Idaho if this is allowed to occur?
I'll go first on that. I definitely think it will be to their detriment for a number of reasons. First of all, we have had a goal in the state of Idaho to get more kids to go to college, forever. When kids go to college, they are expected to be able to think and read and write critically. That means they need exposure to a wealth of ideas. We have a lot of concurrent enrollment classes. We have advanced placement classes. I know as a former advanced placement English language teacher that a whole section of that test is on argumentation. And that means, that throughout the year, we are training students to look at controversial issues sometimes, and you want to try to get things that are relevant. So of course, with everything that's been going on in the country right now, the whole idea of racism in the country is extremely relevant. So I'm thinking if I were an AP English teacher, I would really want to explore that. I would want to have students find primary sources and secondary sources, and let's look at documents that are factual, and let's use them as evidence. So we're withdrawing that ability. All of AP social studies and history, students can't look into the factual information about racism. That's just crazy. Plus, it does set them apart. We have a lot of kids that go to school in Idaho, and we have a lot of kids that go to other places other than Idaho. And, the perception of our state is not good when we don't allow kids to think freely, and we don't allow them to explore ideas. I have a great deal of empathy of those kids, those high school kids that went to protest at one of the meetings. And I think they said, hands off my education. They want to learn more. They don't want to learn less. Yeah. We're just undermining them. And, as was brought up, as Mike said, it's not just in post-secondary education that we're undermining them, because they are expected to go into a workforce that has to be tolerant, that is diverse, where they have to deal with a lot of different people and a lot of different ideas. And we're just closing the door to a major topic. It just seems like we're shooting them in the foot, to use a a folksy term there.
Yeah. Maddie?
We'll just quickly echo a lot of what Amy had said as well. When we're teaching kids in the classroom, I think anybody who's spent time in the classroom has realized that if kids don't want to learn something, they're probably not going to learn it. So what we're teaching isn't necessarily what they're taking away into the real world. I think we have to offer the opportunities for them to learn, but ultimately they take with them what they want to take with them. And I think this kind of goes back to Katie's question, is when they go out in the real world, whether their school was diverse or not, it is very likely that the place that they're going to be working or the places that they're going to be living are. And if our goal as educators is to teach them how to be productive citizens, we have to prepare them to not only know the true history and be able to distinguish fact from fiction. We need to teach them how to work well with other people, how to be respectful of other people, regardless of similarities or differences. And I think all of those are things that are taught, and they don't necessarily come naturally for a lot of students. And if I'm not teaching that within my very safe four walls of my classroom, it is going to be infinitely harder for them to figure that out on their own once they are in college or working or living somewhere else.
Definitely.
And if I could just add, Katie, I think that a lot of that applies at the university level. Idaho has made a number of enrollment goals as a matter of its state budget. And a lot of that is met by students who are out of state because of the low number of kids in the state who come to school here. And additionally, most colleges and universities are very much into guaranteeing cultural competency. And so if universities in our state are going to make that guarantee, they're going to have to meet it. And so if we're going to continue to have treating racism one way and combating racism another way, that's just going to continue to cause problems. Finally, I'll say, I know with regards to the US News and World Report rankings for law schools, they are adding a diversity category in terms of the climate on your campus. And so this stuff will now, I know, Mike, I know they almost put it in place for this year's ranking and they decided to wait another year. And so this stuff I think will be trickling to medical schools. It will be trickling to the other graduate schools and to the undergraduates. So I don't know if you're going to be able to hide a lot of this stuff anymore in the way maybe some institutions have hid things. This will now be reflected so that in the marketplace, that commercial marketplace, people can make a choice. And so that's the other important part. There's going to be an economic effect to Idaho as a whole if they cannot meet those enrollment goals at their universities. And once you start that low slide to the race to the bottom on this, it is very hard to pull yourself out of that grave that you dig. And so I just think there's an inevitability for us if we're to remain competitive as an institution. And this hits us particularly hard because we are known for STEM, right? At the University of Idaho, at least, which has a lot of problems for women and people of color. And so it's just going to be more and more transparent if you are not providing a culturally competent educational environment, which the Supreme Court has said for some time is crucial. So I just think that there's an economic problem that we could soon have for our state budgets. So thank you.
Definitely, definitely. So really quick, April, to just kind of piggyback off the question for them. So for teachers who come here or are trying to graduate from a Department of Education school in the area, how will this ill prepare them to maybe necessarily teach in a different state? Say they go to a BSU or U of I or, you know, what CWI, whatever, and they aren't getting that cultural part. How would this, how will it affect them going, say, to Michigan or Florida or somewhere like that?
Well, it's hard to say right now, partly because of what Professor Sanders brought up, that it's incredibly vague. We don't know at this point what it actually means we can or can't teach. I can tell you from the class that I taught, which was a Foundations of Education, which incorporated history of education, sociology, and current issues in education. I don't know, based on the vagueness of the House bill and potentially what this task force is going to recommend, I don't know if I could even teach that class at all.
Mm,
And it's a foundation of education. This is a prerequisite class for teacher candidates that want to go into a teacher education program. So, I mean, if we can't teach that, we can't prepare educators, is really what it comes down to. So they would not, I would say that it would cause major problems as far as certification in other states. But it's so vague, it's intentionally, so vague that we're not really sure what it means and how it's going to impact those classes, but it would impact every level of at least teacher preparation programs.
Okay.
And do you mind me asking, April, when it comes to certification, when you have to do apply stuff, how this could affect teachers? If you're not allowed to teach it, then that means you're not applying it, right? And I'm sorry if you've already talked about that, but that was one thing a teacher said to me specifically. I have to practice teaching this stuff.
Well, like Amy brought up with the Danielson, we use that a lot to correspond with the standards that we're looking for to nominate for certification. And yeah, if we can't observe a teacher practicing those things, we can't say that they can adequately perform the job. So I'm not certain. I mean, really, Katie, we don't know yet just how much this could impact the profession, but I do know that current teachers are fearful with their jobs. A lot of them are committed to doing the right thing, which is, like Mike said, preparing culturally competent students, but they don't know if it's going to cost them their career. And we don't, it's the overall climate of fear that's kind of the pervasive feeling, I think, among a lot of educators right now, that their jobs are on the line.
Maddie, can you speak to that a little bit? The fear that teachers have right now? Because I know you're still in the classroom.
Yes, I am. And I can say that firsthand, I have heard a lot of comments based in fear this year about wanting to do the right thing and being very unsure how it was going to impact either their job or their reputation. I know just from some of the things that I have said this year, I've been told that I need to watch out for my own job instead of speaking up on some things. I think everything that April said is very true for educators, and that's also a very tough choice for people to make when it's about their livelihood, especially if they have a family, versus sticking up for their students. I think it's easy to say that everybody's going to make like the morally right decision that they know is the right decision, and that looks very different like in real life when educators have to make in the moment decisions.
So we have a couple of audience questions, one specifically for Mike. So earlier in your introduction, you talked about the 6 educators that were qualified, well, 5 besides yourself, that are qualified to speak to CRT. And the question is, are those K through 12 teachers or university level teachers?
There are uniformly university level teachers
Yeah.
Across the board.
Definitely. The other question is, and I don't know who can answer this, but are there any Black educators responsible for vetting classroom curriculum? So I know, Tekla, you're on the Answer board, right? At Answer Charter. So you would be responsible for vetting that particular school's curriculum, or do you not get involved in that process?
Not necessarily on the curriculum. Yeah, I was going to add that to your previous question. Just the board responsibilities are pretty much, focusing on the vision of the school district, annual budget, and then follow up with teacher parenting and so on. But the curriculum pretty much is under the Idaho Department of Education,
So
or the school district.
So it's the district's job to build the curriculum flat. There's no outside like legislation, there are no government entities. So let me ask you guys this. And I read an article earlier last week, sorry, that talked about what some retired educators thought the motivation behind what's happening right now. And if you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your opinion about it. The article talked about privatizing K through 12 because it has been seen as a form of socialism. Does anyone feel comfortable speaking to that? Or, well, Mike, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, so, the leader of the Idaho Freedom Foundation's name is Wayne Hoffman, and he has in the past clearly said that he doesn't believe that the government belongs in public education. And that article itself actually quoted him in multiple places saying this. So part of this attack is clearly rooted in attempting to damage public institutions, the reputations of public institutions, the reputations of teachers in public institutions. That's clearly an objective of the extreme right in this state. And they've been working for this for a very long time, and they had an enormous amount of success in this last year. And so, if anyone thinks that they have your best interests at heart, they do not. They are working for special interests. They are working for a whole other world that doesn't match any of our values, regardless of what our parties are or anything else. They are really out on the fringe.
Okay.
And I'll just say, I think there's also, if you think about the 2020 legislative session, we had a piece of legislation that banned taking race and gender into account when hiring in places like education. And I see this year's critical race theory ban as an extension of that. One, we already know that Idaho is not getting a flux of applications for people and women of color, and they're not hiring a lot of women and people of color, at least at the higher education level where I'm at. And we know that many people who do study these areas of intersectionality, gender theory, race theory are often women and people of color and queer people. So for me, I think there is just a lot of effort to discourage people from even wanting to come here in the first place. But I'll be honest, I think that there may also be a desire to target people to the extent that this legislation is so vague. It allows basically anyone to make a complaint against anybody whenever you use race. And I can speak personally that it will be used to target you as an educator who speaks to race in the classroom, despite complaints that you should not be doing so, even though you teach race and gender discrimination under the Constitution. So I can certainly understand why teachers without the benefit of tenure like I have are afraid. You should be afraid, but that should not stop you if you feel comfortable from speaking out.
Definitely. So one more question and then we'll get to I know Maddie had a statement and I think April has a statement as well. So this question wants either Dr. Sanders or Mike to discuss how the fear that white students might be discriminated against actually affects students of color.
Yeah. So, well, it has an enormous negative effect on students of color. So everything we do is done in the lens of a white society. Even the whole structure of, and I'll use law school, but even the university structure, right? The university structure, the law school structure was established at the end of the 18th century, focused on how white society learned at that time. And we've carried that through to today. And you actually see law schools now trying to deal with that and trying to disestablish that, not from the perspective of race, but because from the perspective of that doesn't actually work, right? It doesn't work very well, right? And there's other ways to do this. But what it does when you have to walk on eggshells and you can't bring up a topic without fear of being reported to the mind control police or something like that, is it means you avoid addressing that topic. And it has what we call a chilling effect on free speech, right? And it chills the ability of the teacher to speak. It chills the ability of students to speak because people become afraid, right? It encourages an atmosphere of fear. And that has a negative effect on really everybody, right? And so one thing that you have to understand is if you have a negative effect on students of color, you're actually having a negative effect on everyone because we are unable to have these discussions and we are unable to teach our students how to deal with this. So I'll give a real world example. I taught a class that focused a lot on race and structures and that kind of thing. A very conservative white male student in the class. And he took the class because he wanted to learn. He was being very open about it, but he disagreed with a lot of things that happened in that class and what we discussed about. I gave him a chance to talk. We had an open discussion. About 5-6 years later, he got a hold of me. A huge number of his clients are Latina immigrant workers. And he got a hold of me and said, you were right. They are discriminating against them, right? And what you taught me really has helped me deal with this, right? And so if we're unable to have these discussions, right, it hurts everybody, not just students of color, not just white students. It hurts everyone in their ability to be competitive and to operate in society in the future.
And I can say for me, when I think about my classroom, and we do dive into these discussions, as I tell people, I'm an African-American woman. I cannot get away with not talking about race. People would look at me like I'm crazy. They expect it from me. Mike was there when I was hired. I am pretty sure there are a lot of conversations about how, because I was Black, I could talk about race in the classroom, right? I'm sure there are a lot of those types of exceptions.
I recruited her.
So for me, when we talk about fear in the class, I don't think about it as white students' fears versus anyone's fears. To me, it's the fears of those who don't want to address racism and discrimination. Doesn't matter if you're white, doesn't matter if you're Black, right, Latinx, or the multiple cultural identities that we call Asian. Right? To me, if you just have that resistance, whether it's gender, homophobia, there's a problem. So I don't approach it as a white student fear issue. Now, I do understand that the majority of my class is white. And I have to be sensitive to the fact that there is a lot of ignorance because a lot of the majority of my classroom also grew up here, where obviously you were not learning a lot about history. A lot of my students don't know about the real slave trade, right? About the breeding part of the slave trade. So if I'm bringing that into the classroom, they don't know. A lot of my students don't know about real Jim Crow. I had a student tell me, Jim Crow couldn't have been that bad. You could just go to another restaurant. And I'm like, no, that's like the whole thing, is that you could not go to another restaurant, right? Now imagine, I'm trying to teach the Commerce Clause. I don't have time for you not knowing that Black people had to sleep on the side of the road. It's in the case. I don't have time for you to debate that with me. But that's what we get in the classroom. And that is what causes the disruption. Now, I don't care if you're white, Black, Puerto Rican, or whatever. If you're denying that history, you're causing a problem. And here's another thing I'll say about that ignorance, right? The things I've experienced. I was once asked if I was a real African-American. Now I was like, I don't even know what that is, what a real one is versus a fake one. And I think about, what if that had come into my classroom? And there's a lot of ignorant stuff that's come to my classroom, right? That raises to that level. But what if that had come into my classroom? That would have been a whole class, right? That I'm not teaching Plessy versus Ferguson or Dred Scott, because I got to deal with somebody who just doesn't even know, apparently, what an African-American is. And they put it as a what, right? As if it's an object, as opposed to me and my identity. So that's where the problem comes in, that ignorance. To me, and the person who asked me that wasn't even white, right? I could tell that they were not white, but that is just how little understanding that they have about me, the history of my people, and what it means to, right? What is this distinction that you're trying to make here? And when you get to law school and you don't know that stuff, right? We're trying to talk high policy stuff. If you're getting to law school and you don't know that, you can begin to see the disruption that can happen in a law school classroom because your focus has to be very tight. They've got to take a bar exam. There's not going to be a question about being a real African-American on that bar exam. I can guarantee you that. But if that's what I have to spend my time on, you can begin to see how students are not going to be allowed to have the type of cultural competent classroom that they need to become the effective lawyers that this state so desperately is in need of.
And
If I-
to follow up on that is, you know, if you look at law school and where it falls in education land, it's like grade 17, right? And I cannot tell you how many of my students or how many of Professor Sanders' students will come up to us and tell us, you're the first Black professor I've ever had. And that means something. They've never been exposed to these ideas and these concepts. And this is absolutely critical for them to be professionals when they leave, to understand this stuff. And if they've never been exposed to these ideas, and that's already before we have this restrictive law put in place, we're really, really hampering their future, their economic future and their prosperity future. And you really have to give them the opportunity to learn that. You don't have to tell them what to think, and it's not our job to tell students what to think. You have to expose them to the idea and how to think. And what they do with that is their business afterwards. But if you don't give them that exposure, you're not preparing them.
Definitely.
I may say few words, Catherine. In the United States, the older institutions or organizations we get are the most racist they get. I'm not talking about the older people. I'm talking about the older institutions, the system. The reason is those institutions was designed to serve one group of people.
Yeah.
Over time, when things got better, the other groups are trying to fit in, but often they're falling into the crack. So I think we need to have the tough conversation and create a system that would serve the groups that we believe are going to be just living together. Mm-hmm. We're not going backwards to the point where it's going to be okay for only one group of people to have the privilege to go to school, to higher education, or have the other services.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard. So I think our option is just to work together and create a system that was going to serve everybody and everyone.
I agree. Thank you for that, Tekla.
And one other thing, Katie, too, about how this impacts students of color is we are right now so focused on fighting something that doesn't actually exist and being afraid to speak about race at all, that we're not dealing with actual racism that's happening on our K-12 campuses, on our university campuses. You know, as an example, we have Confederate flags that are flown on vehicles in our schools, and we can't address those issues and how that impacts, you know, especially perhaps a Black student having to walk past that to go into an environment, whereas teachers were charged with creating a place where they feel safe so they can learn. So we can't even begin to address the actual issues because we're so focused on trying to prove that we're not doing something that just doesn't exist.
Definitely.
And this is really just agreeing with April, as it truly is a problem, especially now that teachers know that there's a task force like supposedly looking for these types of conversations. Teachers and administration both are much more hesitant to address these issues happening in school that are so negatively impacting our students of color. And it sends such a clear message that we're protecting ourselves because we can, rather than continuing to speak up and do what's right for our students. And that's not to say that like I'm judging the educators who are not speaking up. I think that they're in a tough position too, but I think that there needs to be support from all levels where teachers can stand up for students when actual racist behavior is happening in our classrooms.
Okay. And I know we said we were going to do the statements, but I just have one more question. So Maddie, April, for you guys, what does that support look like? To to foster that, because I know from experience with some parents in the community with the Confederate flag, administrators, teachers, they're not getting that support when issues are brought. I know that there's a form you fill out, but I haven't heard that any resolution comes from the form. It's more just for data collection. So what does that support look like for you?
Are you talking about the Confederate flag specifically?
No, just general issues, not just that specifically. I know that that is a big issue right now because it happens a lot, not just on K-12 campuses, but that's just a thing in Idaho right now where big trucks have big flags. But it has to be really, really hard to have students that come into your classroom after they see that, especially when the community that you're trying to foster is based on trust. And, you know, the guy that sits next to me now has gotten into this truck with this giant flag that tells me I'm not important. What does support for you dealing with that look like?
Sure, I can share that at least in my classroom, it's not just happened like on trucks, it has happened inside like the four walls of my classroom.
Oh.
And when that's supposed to be a safe space for every student to learn, in my mind, that is very much doing the opposite. I think the way some of the rules are written right now, I think most districts and administration are putting that under freedom of speech. From a lot of conversations that I have heard this year, I agree with the 2 thumbs down. I have had a lot of conversations about the Confederate flag specifically. And I know that for me, I didn't have support outside of my classroom, so I handled it inside my classroom. And students knew that if that happened and if students brought any symbols of hate into my classroom, we were going to have a conversation about why that was both inappropriate, unacceptable, disrespectful, and the history that comes along with all of those things. So in my own power, like it was banned in my own classroom, but as a school campus, there's no official ban. And I was told legally there will never be a specific ban in conversations this year, which I don't think is true. I think it was an easy solution given the other conversations happening in the legislature, and not only teachers, but admin being uncomfortable with these conversations. That's the easier solution, is to say we can't do anything instead of figuring out how we can do anything. So I think right now it comes down to educators supporting students, checking in, making sure that they know that as an educator, I don't support that. As an educator, I'm going to say something. As an educator, I'm here for them. But I did go to some pretty decent extremes this year trying to get that changed, and nothing came of it.
Gotcha.
And I
just want to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, you know, there are some protections for things like that, because in your board policy, usually there is something about disruptions to the educational environment. And so if you have a bunch of students that have those Confederate flags, and then you have a bunch of other students that have anti-white material, and they're, you know, flagging that around, it loses its ability to be just free speech. You have an ability to protect kids. You have an ability to have an educational environment that is conducive to learning. And so, you know, I know in our policies in the Boise district, you know, you can find things like that. I would imagine that if that were taken to court, and you know, you had that possibility of there being a racial war in your classroom, that's definitely a disruption to the educational environment. So I think there are some safeguards you could look at.
And I just want to say, Amy just articulated the actual legal standard on this with regards to free speech in schools. The court has said it's okay to limit speech in the K through 12 context. I find it very difficult to believe even this SCOTUS would allow Confederate flags going on in public schools. But I think this is sort of hits the nail on the head, because if school districts continue to uphold that policy, but then allow teachers to be disciplined, tracked, investigated for teaching race, you've got a constitutional violation there, clear cut. And that's what the problem is going to be. Will a lot of these districts allow racism to proliferate and ban anti-racism? You're going to have a problem there.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Sanders. Okay, Maddie, I know you had a statement from a fellow teacher that you wanted to read really quick. And then April, you had, and then we'll.
Sounds good. Thanks, Katie. So this is a quick statement from a fellow educator. She is a language specialist, kind of going back to Amy's comments earlier about the EL program, and an EL teacher at the school that I was teaching at. And she wrote the statement because she was unable to be here with us tonight, but wanted to be able to contribute and participate. So I would like to address the following remarks to the concerned community of the great state of Idaho. I have been teaching in the Treasure Valley community in some capacity since 2006. Currently, I teach English language learners, and I am very involved with students and families of our migrant community. The teachers I work with, as well as myself, focus on giving tools to students to be successful and contributing citizens of our great nation, as well as becoming lifelong learners. Those tools include strategies and skills that allow students to interact with others socially, academically, as well as for the future workforce. We teach through the sciences, history, mathematics, as well as through the humanities, such as literature and music. If we begin to censor these topics because we are afraid of indoctrination, then we in turn are contributing to an indoctrination of someone's point of view. Currently, teachers try to give various points of view, as well as full and accurate accounts of history and the sciences. We do not teach our personal points of view, but engage students to think critically and base their own opinions on facts and research. These are skills we teach. We do not tell our students what to believe or what to think. We include and promote independent student thought, not the other way around. Unfortunately, our current political climate has led our community to think that teachers are indoctrinating students to be unpatriotic. This could not be further from the truth. We teach history as it is, with all its uncomfortable truths, so we may learn from the past to guide us toward a better future. As I mentioned earlier, I work with migrant families, and I myself am an immigrant to this country. Many people of the migrant community, as well as myself, have left our home countries in pursuit of what this great country has to offer: freedom. The freedom this country offers its community is what many seek as they leave their war-torn or oppressive governments that do indoctrinate and teach their citizens falsehoods through selective or fragmented history. Let's not continue spreading falsehoods that our teachers and educational institutions are teaching critical race theory as a way of putting the white community in a bad light, nor should we censor or fragment the teaching of historical truths because they don't fit a political agenda. With this idea, I would like to leave you not with my own words, but with a message from former President Ronald Reagan that he gave in his farewell speech to the nation. He stated, "We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise. And freedom is special and rare. It's fragile, it needs protection. So we've got to teach history based not in what's in fashion, but what's important. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit."
Thank you so much for that, Maddie. April, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a portion of the statement that we had several educators sign on to, and I think we'll make it available through the chamber, and then it's also out in the world in some of the articles that have been written about tonight already. So, but if you're interested, we can definitely get you a copy of this. And like I said, we're still collecting signatures and hoping that it'll empower more teachers and educators in our area to stand up. What is being called indoctrination by some is quite literally educators doing their jobs, and none of it's influenced by critical race theory, socialism, communism, or Marxism. We are contracted with our specific district to teach adopted content standards. These standards are established at the state level following extensive review and based on national standards. Per the Idaho State Department of Education, each school district may set standards more rigorous than these state content standards, but no district shall use any standards less rigorous than those set forth. It is still up to each local school district to adopt its own curriculum, how the standards are taught, to meet these standards. Idaho reviews and revises, when needed, all content standards on a 6-year review adoption cycle. Within our district standards, we have some level of professional discretion as to how the objectives are met, but in no way are we given carte blanche, nor do we believe we are entitled to unquestioned freedom. We strive to implement best pedagogical practices, including use of primary and secondary sources, offering multiple perspectives and varied narratives. We are transparent about our honest teaching of American history according to state mandated standards. We in no way teach our students to hate our country. Rather, our goals as educators surround preparing our students to think critically and engage meaningfully with the world around them. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others associated with the civil rights movement were labeled as Marxist by those who wish to silence their voices and efforts. We are earnestly requesting that our Idaho neighbors and community members educate themselves on what CRT is and what it isn't. Our children deserve a full and truthful education, and efforts to limit their access can only lead to diminished opportunity to engage in culturally relevant learning, decreasing their readiness to take on the world. We, the undersigned, fully support the statements above and reaffirm our commitment to upholding the highest standards of our profession.
Thank you so much. So I know it's getting close to that time. I would like for Mike and Dr. Sanders to leave us with just some thoughts on maybe what the next steps could be. And yeah.
Well, I don't know. But I just want to actually take the time to thank the students who have been speaking out and showing up at these task force hearings. I want to thank all of the teachers who have been putting their careers on the line to speak up and speak out without the benefits of tenures or full professorships or any of the things that you get in higher education. I also want to thank all of the parents who are listening today, even those who think that critical race theory is bad. I think it's good to understand what you don't understand. And for those parents who are trying to fight for culturally competent education for their children, understand you fighting this fight is all your kids need to see. My mom would have been at this panel. My mom would have been on this panel. My mom would have been at those task force meetings, and I would have been watching her. And I don't know if all of the parents out there and the students, or if you teachers understand what these kids are seeing you do right now is the best education they're going to get. So keep it up. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, if there's anything I can explain about your constitutions. I'm happy to talk to your faculty meetings, your school board meetings, anything that you need that I can do to provide you with support. And I'll just say to all of us out there in the university land with tenure and promotion, I understand your fear of speaking out. Trust me, I do. But what is the value of your job if you have to live in fear?
Mm.
And what I'll say is courage. Courage is not being unafraid. Courage is figuring out how to stand up to that fear. They are feeding off of fear right now. They are trying to make you afraid. They are trying to make society afraid right now. And unfortunately, we have a lot of leaders in government who are not showing courage. So then that means it falls upon us to show the courage, right? And to be the leaders that we can be. And we can all be leaders, right? Every single one of us can be a leader. I'm a professional leader. I've been a leader since I was a United States Navy officer. Right, but I'm telling you right now, we can all be leaders. How we do that is we show the courage to stand up to our fears and to stand up to what we know is wrong, and to say this is not part of our community values and our standards. We support you 100%. I left the university. I gave up my tenure. I did it to do this fight. All right, I did it because I didn't want to fight that fight in my institution, right, which had problems. Right, I did it because I saw a higher calling. And it's time for all of us to come together. We have your back. We will be there. The Idaho 97 will be there. A whole lot of people will be there. You would be amazed at how many people are supporting these efforts right now. So keep standing up for what's right and show the courage that our leaders are not showing right now.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for participating this evening. I know that with where we are right now, it is not an easy decision to make. So I really, really do appreciate you all for saying yes and committing to this fight with us. As a parent and as a person working in the community, I know that it is a fight we will probably be fighting for a very long time. But I'm with you guys. I'm committed to, boots on the ground, digging in and making it the best that we can, because I believe that with the work, Idaho can be everything that it purports to be today. But if we don't fight this fight, then we're going to be setting our children up for failure, and we can't have that. So I thank you all for coming. And I thank you all for watching. If you would like a copy of the recording, it will be available. Just email through the chamber at info@accofidaho.com, or you can view it. You can review the Facebook Live later on this evening, or it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel as well. We hope to have more important discussions like this in the future. But with that, we wish you all a good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.